I'm going to ask Peter a few questions, and then I'm more than happy to open it up, and Peter will talk to you all. How's that? But I have a lot of questions, as you can see. But first I want to say, it's so great to hear your voice reading this, because this character isn't you, right?
No.
And that's an important thing, and I want to talk about that in a little bit. But I want to say, for me, the most important thing always in any book, really, is character. Like, for me, stuff can happen, and that's great, but there has to be a certain depth of character. And I should say a lot happens in this book. A ton happens in this book. But Vicencio is an incredibly real character to me. And that, to me, was really the... I was so captivated by him. His befuddlement is so... Like, yes, he's a pretty powerful guy, or he was, in his job. But you capture somebody really in a great deal of confusion that I related to. So I'm wondering, this is just by way of saying, is how did you get into this guy's head, and how did you make him so real?
There were a couple things. I mean, again, growing up in D.C., going to one of these fancy private schools, as I did, I observed, or had a chance to observe, the inside lives of these people who wield a lot of power. And everyone sort of knows that, of course, Barack Obama is this guy who wields a lot of power. But if you're in D.C., you get to learn, I think as that show like House of Cards shows and other shows like that will show you, there's a way in which the levers of power are being pulled by these very ordinary people in these very ordinary offices on K Street, very suburban, kind of like, they might as well be like a mid-level bureaucrat, and they are, but they make a decision that impacts the lives of hundreds of thousands of people on a regular basis. And I remember I once was my father worked at the IMF, and which is interesting. But I remember once we were at breakfast, and there was this very sweet Japanese guy who was a colleague of his, Yusuke Horiguchi, who was in charge of Eastern Europe for the IMF. And they had just given the IMF a $50 billion loan, which is the largest loan in the history of, of the planet, I guess. But they were doling out the loan in weekly installments. And Russia was not collecting taxes on the rich, because obviously. But so Yusuke said, this is a problem. They actually need to collect these taxes. And so I don't know what to do. They're not doing it. And so I'm just going to cut off the loan. And he was this sweet guy. He was playing in a mariachi band, like on the weekends for fun, like to drink whiskey and make inappropriate jokes. And this guy, like the next day, the front page of the Washington Post is IMF suspends loan to Russia. And within a week or two, Russia had capitulated and was collecting those taxes, and they turned the spigot back on. And he was just this incredibly innocuous guy. I mean, you would never think that this guy was able to twist the arm of a superpower.
And that's what struck me, is I don't think I've ever encountered, I've read books about politicians who have power, but
right.
This is real. This is like more significant power in a lot of ways. And
it's much more subtle.
Yeah, but it has real consequences, as he talks about throughout the book. I mean, it's real. Part of the reason he leaves is because, and that's confused. But he's so human, and in some ways humane, and yet the policies that he personally is responsible for, including what you just read, have real consequences.
Yeah, and it's partially my dad as well. I mean, the book owes a lot to my dad. It's dedicated to my dad. And I, along with a lot of the kids, we called ourselves WBGKs, World Bank Group Kids. We were these like international lot who protested outside of these offices. We were in there, banging on the bongos and getting tear gas and everything. And then we would go in for lunch. It was this very confusing relationship between the different places, and we would argue, of course, as like 15-year-olds. You're arguing with your father and mother, whoever works within the bank or the IMF, about what they're doing. And you're like coming very ill-equipped to this discussion. They have, of course, a lifetime of information that they've amassed. They have PhDs from lofty institutions in economics and whatever, and they're like, they can just dismantle your every argument with like their left hand tied behind their back. I mean, it's so easy for them. And it makes you, in a way, strive harder. And it makes you also, I think, for me, really appreciate the complexity of these questions. And I've lived a lot in, as I know you have as well, in sort of very poor countries or so-called emerging markets in South America and in Asia. And you learn that these issues are very complicated. And there's not, if it looks easy or simple and black and white, you probably haven't done your homework, or you probably haven't really looked at it hard enough, because these questions are always complicated. And those guys, I still would write. I mean, when I became an adult and was writing for this think tank, I would write stuff about how the IMF's policies were terrible, but it was from a place of greater understanding than when I was a teenager.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but I want to get back to economics because it's fascinating to me, and I learned a great deal about things that I really hadn't thought about, and I should have thought about. I mean, what you sort of force us to by putting real people in this situation, then we get to feel it, whereas I get to, I can throw as much stones in my mind at Paul Wolfowitz as I did and do.
And he's in the book.
He is in the book, but I want to take a step back again because I feel like it isn't the whole story.
Yeah.
This is a man who gets under your skin in a way that I think is very unusual and extremely poignant. And I just want to read a scene that's fairly late in the book and just ask you to talk about it a little bit. This is Vicencio is in Bolivia, where he is he's involved with the Evo Morales election, and he's there to give some props for Evo Morales. What would you call it?
It's like the inauguration around then, so he's supposed to sort of come out and sort of be a sort of avatar of,
which is a pretty big deal for somebody on the far left as Evo Morales to have a former World Bank official there, which is it's a huge deal. And so Vicencio, even he's sort of in his befuddled way, is becoming a player in some ways. But anyway, this is a scene that really doesn't have to do with that. But his PR person, Evo Morales' PR person, picks him up at the airport, and they have this wonderful conversation. I have to ask you. Let's talk about the sleeping in a moment.
Was she falling asleep at the car?
I just have to say, I'm going to interrupt my question for a minute. So this PR person who he's had email contact with, his name is Lenka.
Yeah.
She picks him up at the airport in La Paz, which is really interestingly described in a place that I became fascinated with just in your description of it. But imagine being picked up at the airport by somebody who basically falls asleep at the wheel of the car that's bringing you into the city that you've never been before, and he actually has to take over. And anyway, they end up talking fairly intimately, fairly quickly. This is just a little bit of their conversation. So she says, "My husband was a mistake too, but at least he gave me Ernesto, her son, who's my favorite person. And I like him, my ex-husband. I hate him and I like him. I felt that way about my wife," says Vicencio. "You were also divorced?" He hesitated, impaled on the moment, then nodded. He had developed this unfortunate habit of lying to avoid explaining about Christina. When he didn't say anything else, she said, "I picked Evo because of who he is," and then they go back to talking about politics. But I just, that scene kind of encapsulates, first of all, his wife is dead and has died, so he has trouble talking about that. But there's so many moments where it becomes about Vicencio as a very damaged human being.
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply, I feel like I don't want to write a book that's about politics that's like an op-ed, which is fine in 2 pages, but 250 pages is pretty boring op-ed. I don't know. So I'm really interested in the complexity of people, and in particular, I like this character as a person. I've sort of, not to be too autobiographical, but I've sort of dealt with a sort of amount of death in my life in a certain way, and the ways in which it is so sort of devastating, but then also it sort of causes a great amount of shame. And he's struggling with how to incorporate her death and her absence into his life, into his identity. I mean, so much of the book is about his identity sort of falling apart in his hands. And then he's like, well, if it's that fragile, then who am I and who do I want to be? And he starts asking these very difficult questions that lead him into a tough place. But
and it's not as if it's not as if their relationship was so wonderful. It was complicated like everybody's relationship. It's one of my favorite parts in the book is earlier when he's reading his wife Christina's copies of Milan Kundera's books and trying to get the feeling that she gets from reading them. He's a very literate guy, but he can't quite feel what she feels, and I thought that was especially moving, especially since at that point I know she's gone.
Yeah, he has a hard time. Part of the difficult thing for him, I think, about having lost this woman is their relationship was pretty terrible for a long time, but then it started to improve right before she died. And he's, as happens when you lose somebody permanently to death, your memories are, the memories are sort of a dream machine. And so all of his memories of her are immediately sort of becoming subjected to the influences of his mind, and he's finding himself becoming suspicious of his memories. Why is this memory drawn out? And it's like perception, not just of his wife, but in all sectors, is kind of, you're constantly inserting yourself in what you want to remember of the person becomes the story. How you want to perceive them influences your perception of them. And it's a sort of a subsidiary loss to the actual primary loss of the death is the loss of a clear vision of the person, because they become a kind of marionette that you have created that represents what you want to think of as the person for whatever reason.
And I want to say, this is a very grief-struck book. You have a fascinating conversation in some of the materials that I received with David Shields, where he talks about your sadness in the book.
It's a funny book, too.
It is a very funny book. It's a very hopeful. There's a certain hope in his struggle to get past his personal tragedies and also his professional, losses.
Yeah.
And he, like us all, he's got to move on. Except again, it goes back to the fact that this is a guy who works at a place that the whole world thinks is causing a great deal of harm, and I think that's largely true.
Yeah.
However, as you say, it's not so simple.
Complicated.
But I feel like I start to understand a little bit more of the pressures that somebody like that is under. And I guess I want to just shift a little bit and ask about writing about real people.
Oh yeah.
And I had a lot of fun with with Abel Morales, with Wolfowitz, and other people that come up that are real. There's also references to Occupy Wall Street, the Kyoto Protocol, the Bush years, 2005. It felt like fairly recent history. The first time I'd seen it fictionalized in a dramatic way, and I wonder what that's like to work with stuff that you've lived through fairly recently.
I love writing historical fiction about incredibly recent history. That's kind of my thing. It's like I'm like what happened 2 years ago, and then I look at that, and I like to mess with you. Bring real people in, fictitious people, real events, fictitious events, and sort of blend them together in a way, and it's quite entertaining. I wrote a short story once in which, what's his name, the Fog of War, McNamara was, he was like the main character essentially. And it was very interesting. I once saw McNamara in D.C., this classic D.C. moment. He was riding the metro. He was just sitting there, this old, sad, crumpled man in his dirty trench coat. And I was like, my God, that guy ran the world for a couple years and sort of ruined the world in a variety of different ways. So it was sort of extraordinary to see, and but I've always enjoyed that interplay. And I think it came from, originally I read a story by David Foster Wallace called Little Expressionless Animals. Everyone knows it. It's an amazing story. And it's set on the set of the show Jeopardy. And the first time I read it, I was like, well, this is not fiction, clearly, because it's so realistic. It's so lived in. it just feels like he wrote like a feature-length essay for, I don't know, the New York Times or something about Jeopardy, behind the scenes of Jeopardy, and I'm like, that's weird. And then I started Googling all the names of the people, and they were not, I mean, Trebek's real, but none of the other people existed. And it occurred to me that this was actually a work of fiction, and I was so impressed by how he made you confused about what was real and what wasn't real. It made you question, it made you dig into the little spaces in the story in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And I really love that energy, and especially for something that's sort of political in nature, to sort of play with that and force the reader to think a little bit harder about what's happening, who these people are.
Well, that's what happens in this book. And you know, somebody like Evo Morales, who, you know, is a important world figure because of what he represents to a lot of people on the left. What was it like to, and this is not his first appearance in your work.
Yeah, I've written about him in the past.
The only fiction writer to write about Evo Morales.
I keep sending my books to him, but as of yet, no blurb for some reason. I actually know he has two photographers. One of them is a Bolivian fella who takes his pictures in La Paz. But whenever he travels, he has this other guy, a gringo, takes his pictures. And it's sort of like a hush-hush thing. He's like, because it's sort of, I don't know, he thinks it will damage his credibility if it's known that this white guy's taking his pictures. But that guy has been traveling with Evo Morales for like 4 years. He gets paid almost nothing.
For people who aren't up on Evo Morales,
Yeah.
currently, explain who he is and why he's important in the
it's
book.
interesting because around then, 2005, there was a shift, a really significant shift taking place in the global sort of power dynamics, in the sense that a lot of these so-called emerging markets, which have been these poor countries that have really been in trouble perpetually in a very intense way, were stabilizing, and we're actually not having revolutions every month, and we're having a certain kind of economic stability and prosperity. And within that context, a lot of the power dynamic shifted. A lot of these countries, in Bolivia, for example, they had always elected, although the country is 70% indigenous, they had always elected essentially white people with Harvard degrees to run their country. And they stopped. And a lot of these countries stopped. Brazil, notably, but also Ecuador. Bolivia, it was a big deal. He was the first indigenous president of this very indigenous country. And he didn't really care about what the US thought, what the World Bank thought. He was kind of like, fuck you, we're doing fine without you. And he said, you know, I'm going to cut my own salary in half. And he did. And he did a lot of other things like that. And he was, it turned out, a man of his word in a lot of ways. I mean, he's not perfect by any means. But he turned out to be the real deal. And a lot of people did. And it really floundered and confused these sort of archetypes, especially from the sort of racist, I don't know, State Department of the United States, who were sort of like, now you'll mess up, you'll start stealing. And he was like, no, I'm not going to do that, and I'm just going to be a person of honor and integrity. And what do you think about that? And he was a socialist as well, but not so much a socialist that he kind of, the country's doing well, and he's actually implementing a lot of these policies, and it's pretty cool, actually, to behold. And this is that pivot moment when the Washington consensus, these people in D.C. are kind of beginning to be seized with panic at the fact that they're losing control of their colonies.
It freaks them out. I mean, somebody like Evo Morales, especially when he's not stealing, right? When
it turns out to be the real deal in a way.
And so I just thought, that in the book, when he enters the scene, you know, the stage of the book, and Sensio's sort of there, present, it just made it all the more real.
Part of the tough thing, though, is I have my opinions about Evo Morales.
Right.
But I can't let those be the story, because that would be, again, an op-ed, which is quite boring. Vincenzo's positions are more complicated than mine, and his perception is more complicated than mine. He is not terribly fond of Evo Morales. He likes certain aspects, but he hates certain aspects.
Yeah,
and I need
says
that
he expects him to start messing up.
Yeah. And he would expect Evo Morales to start failing. And I sort of, you know, I think it's Kundera who said, like, the stupidity of people comes from having an answer for everything, and the wisdom of the novel comes from having a question for everything, and that to me seems very important in this kind of writing, where if it's very easy, black and white, then it's not very interesting. It has to be complicated.
And how are we doing?
8:15.
I think I'll ask one more question.
One more
then
question,
I'll
then we'll
open it
ask
up
a
to
more,
you
a
all.
couple from the piece.
Because you mentioned certainty, and that is a big issue here, because Senso comes from a place where certainty, there's a high premium on certainty,
Right.
at least pretending you have it. And,
Right.
And I think what makes him different, and there's actually moments in the book where he's called out on his being different,
Right.
and maybe he always was different, but he's especially different after he leaves the bank.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how you approach this issue of tackling the problem of certainty.
It's an interesting question at the heart of the book in a way, because he's sort of railing against fundamentalism of any stripe. But what you get if you have no firm opinions is he sort of rejects any certainty. He believes it's sort of a precursor to fundamentalism, religious, political, whatever it happens. And so as a result, he's presented with this array of options. He's being courted by a hedge fund, by Lehman Brothers, and liberal think tanks, all these different things. And he has a very hard time committing to anything. He's sort of paralyzed by the conflicting sort of winds of his whim, and his conflicting winds of his kind of his notions of what is true and what is real. And so and I think there's a way in which if you refuse to make a decision, you're making a decision. And so he actually does make a number of pretty intense decisions.
He does.
But he kind of relinquishes his sense of sort of agency. He's sort of like, my decisions, I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm going to make a decision, and the results of those decisions are arbitrary in a way.
And he's not certain about his decisions, which is why
Exactly.
I liked him. He makes them, but he's not a true believer in what he's doing. And that makes me trust him. I would put him, after he leaves the World Bank, then I'd want to put him back in charge of
In the World Bank, exactly.
But that's never going to happen because the powers that be are never going to trust this guy again.
Exactly, yeah,
And,
that's true.
And that's what actually liberates him and makes it, I think,
That's true.
a hopeful book. Rather than, I have other questions about what you're working on now and some other stuff, but let's open it up for people who
Yeah,
have
if anyone
questions.
has a question.
Thanks. I picked up your first book because I think it was just, I'm more interested in economics. And
Right.
I loved it. It was just captivating and very entertaining. You're to me, like the John Grisham of my life.
Of this book.
No.
Yeah.
Just
Somebody
can't-
has to find a way to make it interesting.
can't put it down. Anyway,
Right.
so thank you. And my question really revolves around, I guess I have a certain slant. Maybe it's because it's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Outside of my family work and everything, is the economic times we're in right now, where I think it's extraordinary. I mean, just the term quantitative easing,
Right.
that's never been done before. I mean,
Yeah.
and people think, oh yeah, the economy's great.
Right.
What is your take on it? I have my take, obviously, from what I've
On
just
what's
mentioned.
happening now with the economy?
Yeah, or just the general terms.
Could
Not
you guys define quantitative easing for the rest of us?
it's money printing.
Yeah, essentially it's a way of doing it without physically printing money, but
That's all it is. It's you have more money, it means less.
yeah. And they're trying to do that in order to sort of stimulate the economy, and the reason they continue to do it is that there's no apparent inflation. But I think I'm impressed, frankly, by what's happening. It could be so bad, and it's terrible, but it could be really bad. Having looked at a lot of these sort of emerging markets and the kind of catastrophes they were experiencing in the 90s and 80s and 70s, this it seems relatively sane in a way. Obviously it was hideous, the implosion, but it's not what you would see when I was in Ecuador and I arrived, and it was 4,000 sucres to the dollar, and then after about a year it was 25,000 sucres to the dollar. So everyone who had savings didn't have savings anymore. And I watched physical runs on the bank, people trying to break down the door of a bank to extract their savings, literally physically trying to break down the door. And then they abandoned their currency. They took their currency and burned it all. They just got rid of it. They were like, we're not going to use our currency. We're just going to use the US dollar from now on. And it was an amazing kind of thing to witness, the ways that these economic policies impacted the very small interior lives of my friends and people I hung out with there, business owners and other people. All my friends were Ecuadorian, and their lives were just torn asunder by these policies being decided by these leaders, many of them, Harvard educated. One of the guys fled the country in the middle of the night on a Learjet and literally landed in Boston, and within a week he was teaching at Harvard. His family and him, they were living in Harvard's campus housing for a year while he got his up and running, and he still teaches there. Good for him. You can go and take classes from him, econ classes of all things. But yeah, Kamil Mohad, yeah. But yeah, I don't know if that's sort of a meandering response to that question, but
I guess my take is that we could have something like you've seen in the here, and what that would mean. I mean, how
Like
would,
anarchy, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we've never had that, or
No,
not
yeah,
even
I mean, when you
close.
think about,
like if the inflation were to really get carried away, what that means, like that's World War II right there is what essentially happened, was they had a terrible finance minister in the 20s, and that laid the groundwork for Hitler, It was, you look at the correlation between economic catastrophe and social catastrophe, and there's a pretty close correlation. It's terrifying. But I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen here, unfortunately. I'm just an optimist. I'm a very happy guy.
Thanks.
Is there another question from the audience? Yeah, hey.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, you said that you wanted to, maybe the book started because you wanted to write about somebody in this world, like the World Bank.
Right.
I was wondering, like, when you had the idea of having him leave the world. Was that early on? Like, did you?
Leave the bank?
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't resist the conversation that he has with that guy that causes him to eject out of the bank. It was so, like, once I wrote it, I was like, this has to happen. And part of it was also I had met a guy who was a leader in the Rainforest Coalition who was protesting outside the bank. And I basically brought that real person into the book. He was like Yale educated, studied economics, wore a suit, but was otherwise full-blown like WTO protester with, he was the ultimate protester. And the reason he was so impressive, I think, was that instead of being sort of looking like a protester, he was like, we need discipline. I want real results from these protests. So he protested until he actually got an audience with the executives at the World Bank. And then when they sat down, they were like, so what do you have to say, you silly hippie? And he was like, these are the reasons your policies are failing. And he started citing statistics, and they got a little uncomfortable. They were like, what are you doing? Oh my God, he knows more than I do. That was a time, it was around 2000, when there was a real pivot in not just the protests. There were so many protests outside of those institutions, but the quality of the protests, the quality of the leadership of them changed, and so they were actually able to, we had like Bono or whatever, and others who were sort of coming along with it, and sort of articulating ideas that ended up really happening. I mean, debt relief was laughable in 2000. The leaders of those institutions were like, never in a million years are we going to do that. And then 5-6 years later, they were like, how do we do this in a sane, rational way? And it's become part of their mandate now. I mean, it was impressive to see these people actually affect change in the world so abruptly, just by like blocking entrance. I mean, my father and others who were working at the IMF at the time would wear jeans hiked up to their breasts, of course. Like he's like this super nerd in like a t-shirt and like tucked into the
So they could
jeans.
get in the door.
So they could get in the door, and they would have their suit in a bag. And you're like, you're not going to blend in. I don't know what to tell you. You look like an aging economist. No one's going to buy it. But that's what they would do to get in. Yeah, it was interesting. It was an interesting experience. Yeah. Maybe one more question? What do you think? Anyone? Another question? Before we adjourn to the bar, or actually I'm going to sign copies.
Well, can you talk a little bit about Occupy Wall Street, its role in the book, and its role in sort of...
I misforecasted it pleasantly in a op-ed that you guys can look up, which is published in the Seattle Times. Got me an impressive amount of hate mail. It was around the peak of Occupy Wall Street, and I was like, these guys, the liberals in the United States almost had their own Tea Party. Now, wouldn't that have been great if we had had this incredibly effective sort of our own Tea Party to like bash the Republicans with and get our way, and it would have been so awesome. But these people were sort of too sort of loosey-goosey. I remember Colbert interviewed some of them, and he basically just like fell apart in front of him. They're like, my name is, Wind, and he was like, Wind, and your name's Feather, and he was like, oh my god. So he just like couldn't help himself. He had to make fun of them. And so like I was like, these people, like we could have had such a great thing here. But they kind of blew up, and they're going to just fade away. And they did fade away, and it was so much better for that. They changed the conversation entirely. This notion of 1% versus 99%, all that stuff was implanted in the mass consciousness of the country. And now the liberals in the United States are not saddled with a Tea Party, which is apparently a major problem for the Republicans. They're like, we have this like, it's like that movie where the guy grows a head. You know what I'm talking about? How to Get Ahead in Advertising? Yeah. There's a head that grows out of him and yelps at him and is screaming at him the whole time. That's what the Republicans now have. They have a two-headed monster, and it's unsightly. You're like, oh, Jesus, so awkward. I was just watching TV today, and they had the turtle guy. What's his name? Mitch McConnell. And the guy looks like a turtle. Him and his Paul Rand Paul. Yeah, those two guys were like sitting next to each other. I've never seen two people look more antagonistic, but they were like friends. Like, you guys are not friends. They clearly hate each other. Like they're gonna just stab each other at any minute now. But they're like buddies.
Right. Well, Rand Paul doesn't want anybody on his right flank.
No, yeah,
that's he's trying to protect him.
But it was interesting. I mean, I totally miscast it, and I in retrospect, I was dead wrong. I mean, it was.
But in the book, the people that make that pressure from the left do sort of, I think make him a better person.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's very swayed.
He's
very swayed by them, but I think he's partially swayed because he has this relationship with his daughter, who he adores, and she kind of hates him. Or doesn't hate him, but she's getting past him.
Right.
She has to live her own
grieving
life.
her mother and all sorts of things.
There's a lot of stuff going on.
Just having these ideas out there, or moving, and I think you have to move one individual at a time. And so that's what I think the book for me comes down to.
Clearly swayed by that one guy. They become sort of buddies, him and this protester. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
You want to sign books? I'll sign. Shirley, you have books too.